We're honoring people who chose to help, 11 million people who had no choice. They had no choice and were persecuted by the Nazis. And that's just a very sombering thing to keep thinking about what happened years ago. And so I'm honored that the mayor and the city council of Edina chose, after recommendations from the Human Rights and Relations Commission, to remember this day and this week as the days of remembrance. And so I'm very honored to actually introduce our mayor, Jim Hublin, who's going to talk a little bit more about this and the rest of the program this afternoon. For those of you who don't know, Jim has been our mayor since 2004, but has been a member of the city council since 1997. And his continued dedication to the city and his support of this is certainly showing what it means to Edina to come together and remember those who had no choice. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming over this afternoon. Extraordinarily important day. I'm looking in the back and I see Joni Bennett, one of my colleagues from the City Council. I want to recognize her. Edith Olmog from our school board, who's just a terrific resident of ours. So our city has a brief, but I would say very strong history with regard to human rights. Am I getting feedback on this? I put it a little further away. With the encouragement of Ellen Kennedy, who was also one of our residents, who runs the World Without Genocide. You saw their table set up out there. On July 3rd, 2007, the day before the 4th of July, our city council passed a resolution condemning the genocide in Darfur. And I had taken the suggestion from Ellen to the Human Rights and Relations Commission at that time and asked them to look at it and to see whether they thought it was appropriate for a city to be doing this. I had my own personal feelings about whether we should be doing it, but I wanted it to go through the right channels, so it went through the Human Rights and Relations Commission with the unanimous recommendation that we adopt this resolution condemning the genocide in the Darfur region of Sudan. And lo and behold, we come to find out sometime later that we are the third city in the United States to pass this resolution condemning the war in Darfur. Chicago and San Francisco were ahead of us. Behind San Francisco and Chicago trailed Edina as a third city to pass this resolution. We subsequently passed a resolution, some people would call it a disinvestment resolution, but we passed a resolution saying that we would not invest in any companies doing business in Sudan. I don't think we were in that position with the type of investing that cities typically do, but nonetheless, we wanted the world to know that we were at least one community that was not going to invest in any companies that were engaged in a country where there was genocide being committed. The next thing we got involved in through our Human Rights and Relations Commission and their active work in our community was the issue of domestic registration of partnerships. And we became the first suburban community in Minnesota to have a domestic partner registry because we thought it was important that our community stand up for the civil rights of our fellow citizens, fellow residents of the state, in the GLBT community. And so we stand strong on that resolution. What's going on right now at the state legislature is troubling. And we need to figure out how to deal with that. So I'm trying to not get too political here. Then in just last week, again, our Human Rights and Relations Commission, composed of residents of our community, thought we should do something about bullying, which is becoming very prevalent in our society. And so we had a session, Reflections on Bullying, just this past week. Meg Newell and another woman, Meg, you want to raise your hand? And another woman, Lisa Finsness, on our Human Rights and Relations Commission, helped coordinate that event, which was a very successful event. I'm sitting and looking at Arnie Bigby in the front row here. He was the chair when we passed the Domestic Partner Registry, and he is also on the State Human Rights and Relations Commission. So we have active representation from our community on the State Human Rights and Relations Commission. I think they met here just a couple of days ago. So, where's John Simon? John, still here? Yeah, there you are. In March, I think it was March 8th of 2011, you sent me an email bringing to my attention the United States Holocaust Museum's National Days of Remembrance. And while my wife and I are members of the U.S. Holocaust Museum, I did not pick up on that. And I'm so grateful that you picked up on it and felt like you should contact me, thought it was important to contact me to see if our city would be interested in participating in this Days of Remembrance. I turned that email around within 24 hours to our Human Rights and Relations Commission to consider participation in support of the national event. Jesse Kingston received that email that you just met earlier. And the Human Rights and Relations Commission, again, recommended conduction of an event, and they recommended that we pass a resolution, a proclamation regarding the Holocaust. And I don't know if, did folks get a chance to see that proclamation? All right, good. So it's not only this particular day of remembrance, but we've got an entire week where we're trying to remember victims of the Holocaust. So this isn't something that I'm proud of. In fact, it bothers me a bit to find out that when John Cashmore from our Human Rights and Relations Commission sent me this email, to find out that we're the only city in the state doing a recognition of this Days of Remembrance for people that were persecuted and murdered during World War II. This is something that we need to keep after, and I'm hoping our Human Rights and Relations Commission starts working with other Human Rights and Relations Commissions from other communities, particularly in the metro area, to get the word out that this is extraordinarily important, that the story needs to be continued to be told. And so we're going to work on that. When 11 million people lose their lives, children, adults, Jews, Roma, dissenting clergy, political prisoners, homosexuals, immigrants, all forced to wear different colored badges to identify them as somebody that is outside the scope of what some particular country thinks is the appropriate type of person to be involved in your society, and then is murdered as a result of that. It is just a horrific, horrific event, and a story that needs to be told and retold and retold. So why do we do this as a city? Why do we get ourselves involved in issues of human rights? Somebody on the city council, a very good city council member, during the time that we were considering the resolution on Darfur, said, well, isn't our job just to make sure that we have high quality basic services? What are we reaching into the world for? And it triggered a very good discussion, so that by the time we passed the resolution condemning the genocide in Darfur, we had a unanimous council, despite the fact that we have a variety of political views on life on the council. I might say that the same thing was true when we passed the domestic registry ordinance. We had a unanimous council recommending passage. So our town has said no, that's not all we just stand for, is delivering basic fundamental services to people. Our community knows, as our former President John F. Kennedy knew, that the rights of every person are diminished when the rights of one are affected. And so our community, the city of Edina, we speak out on issues of human rights, of civil rights, through our residents, our Human Rights and Relations Commission, and our council. While we aspire for perfection in human conduct, we will settle for humanism. And to achieve that level of conduct, the stories must be told and retold. And to help us remember the story of what happened, we have with us today Fred Barron. And I got to meet Fred earlier, and I'm really looking forward to his comments. Fred was 15 years old when the Germans came into Vienna, where he was living in 1938. Both of his parents died in the Holocaust. Fred survived both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Fred was liberated in fact, from Bergen-Belsen. Fred and his wife Judy, who's also a survivor, have 2 children, Gary and Susan. Fred is a resident of Golden Valley, and he has educated and spoken to many schools, churches, and synagogues about what happened to him and his family in 1938. And I want to give Fred, I want us to give him a rousing round of applause for coming here to help us remember the things that we need to remember from the Holocaust. Fred, would you please give him a standing ovation?
Good afternoon. I want to thank Mayor Hublin and the Human Rights Commission of the city of Edina for inviting me here to speak to you on a subject that is far from pleasant. I wish I could talk to you about something more cheerful, but such is life. And it is a fact that every year we Jews set aside one day, Yom HaShoah, to remember the most brutal events of our bloody history during the Second World War. I have written a few notes here that I would like to read to you, but later on I would like to tell you my own personal stories, or at least some of these events that stand more clearly in my mind, even though they are 67 years old. It seems that some of these things you cannot get rid of, and in my personal case, there is not a day that goes by without thinking about some of these events. Two weeks ago, on April 15th, to be exact. Can you hear me? Yeah? It was 66 years that I was liberated in a German concentration camp called Bergen-Belsen. I was 22 years old, starved and near death, a sick and weak survivor of the Holocaust, beginning the slow fight back to health and sanity. I was born in Vienna, Austria, kicked out of school at the age of 15, and had spent 3.5 years in a number of camps, about 2.5 years in internment camps in Hungary, and later on concentration camps, among them Gross-Rosen, Bergen-Belsen, and Auschwitz. When speaking of this subject matter, I usually tell an episode from my own experience, since I know how much easier it is to focus on a real-life story rather than on general observations of an old man. And no matter how reluctant I am to delve into the personal stories I have told so many times, I recognize the importance of doing so and will do so again today. One of the most dramatic experiences of my lifetime was my arrival in Auschwitz in May 1944. And although this happened 67 years ago, it is still chiseled into my mind as if it would have occurred yesterday. I want to tell you that this happened, as I said before, in 1944, in May, when for all practical purposes, the war in Europe was decided. The handwriting certainly was on the wall. The war in Italy was taking place, threatening the soft belly of Germany. The war in the East against Russia has resulted in a ever-increasing pursuit of German troops from the East. The invasion in France was expected at any moment and actually followed, of course, in June. Still, Germany had the will, the capacity to ship about 500,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz in the last moment, it so seems. Among them, myself. The shipment itself, I was taken from a North Hungarian camp, was only about, I would say, 250 miles, but it took the better of 2 days and 3 nights. I'm sorry, 3 days and 2 nights. And took place in cattle cars, in closed wagons with a large sliding door in the center, 2 small windows on each side that were boarded up. And we were driven in there by the German SS without regard, without counting, without saying a word. Men, women, children. In my particular car, we stood like herring, like so, next to each other. It took us hours before we could decide that half of them in the car could sit cross-legged on the floor while the others could stand. And it took several more hours before we decided that we all could sit down if we sat in each other's laps. We had no food, no water, no sanitary facility. There were men, women, children. In some cars, babies were being born, I understand. In all cars, people died. This was not a continuous trip. Sometimes we stood for hours on one spot. Nobody came to open the doors to offer us a drink of water. When the train finally came to a final halt, the doors were torn open, and I was sitting or squatting fairly close to the front. I was just hit by lightning. My eyes were not used to the daylight anymore. But soon we were forced to jump from these cars, and I found myself in the middle of a railroad station. There were several sidings of tracks, and similar trains arrived on other sidings. There were hundreds and hundreds of people standing around, milling around. SS was shouting and yelling, and funny-looking creatures in gray and blue striped suits with long sticks in their hands yelled and screamed at us in all languages. which we didn't understand, but soon we found out we were supposed to separate men from women. So the men separated on one side, and we were ordered to stand in rows of fives. I looked around. There must have been thousands of people. On the edges were German soldiers, SS to be exact, with guns, leveled it out. Why, I don't know. And our row of fives slowly advanced somewhere. And as I walked there slowly with the group, I noticed that although it was May, it was a sunny day, the air was somehow filled with some kind of a cloud. And I could detect some strange smell in the air. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew where we were. But I found out that we are in a place called Auschwitz, of which I have never heard before. Pretty soon I found myself in front of a German officer who had a riding whip in his hand. And with his whip, he pointed left or right, and in whichever direction he pointed, that prisoner was pushed by the guards. And I found out that older people, children, younger men, or women with young children were pushed to one side, while the others, stronger, younger people, were pushed to the other side. I had no idea what that meant, but we are ordered again to form up in rows of fives. After standing there for a couple hours, we were ordered to march out. And we marched away from the railroad station, into a field of flowers and settings of trees, birch trees, if I remember, and yellow flowers. A peaceful scene, if I had ever seen one. And as we slowly walked through this peaceful landscape, one of the fellows in front of me, whom I had known from the camp I was in before, who knew better where we are than I did, slowly turned and walked into the field, into the yellow flowers. The guards yelled, "Stop, stop!" But he wouldn't stop. He marched slowly into the field. Then the guards gave a sign to some of the soldiers sitting in the watchtowers that were built alongside that road. A few shots rang out, and the man fell down. The guards motioned to two people to pick him up and drag him with us back into wherever we were going. That was my reception in Auschwitz. I could stand here for hours and tell you about what happened and what I saw. Let me just tell you that one of the capos, an Austrian political prisoner who had been in prison for many years at that time, probably saved my life and that of several others too, by giving us instructions, telling us where we had arrived. He said, "You had come to a place that is unspeakable. It is not human. It is the end of the world. You have to forget and dispose of everything that you know or learned. You have to look out for yourself. Forget about your father, your brother, your child. You find only a piece of bread and stay alive from one day to the next. A terrible, terrible advice. But some of it sank in. What I got out of it was to live from 1 minute to the next. I didn't have any relatives with me. I didn't have anybody to go to for shelter, for advice. I was all alone. My mother, I learned later on, took the same trip, only she was sent to the other side during the selection and went straight into a gas chamber. These are some of the memories I carry throughout my lifetime. But I want to finish this part by telling you that a year later, on April 15, 1945, when British troops liberated the camp where I was at that time, Bergen-Belsen, after 2 or 3 days of trying to clean up, the British troops forced the German POWs to pick up the thousands of bodies laying around, load them in German-captured trucks, and transport them to previously dug out mass graves. The SS that was caught had to do this with their bare hands. The German POWs, the soldiers, received plastic aprons and plastic gloves to handle the bodies. After a truckload was full, the soldiers squatted on top of the bodies to bury them in the mass graves. And while one of these trucks was passing the little pond in the middle of our camp that served as our water supply, a filthy, stinking, smelling body of water, and we had no longer even access to our drinking water. One of the soldiers on top of the truck dove off and dove into the water. The small armored car that followed, a British armored car that followed each truck, ordered the truck to stop, and the soldiers on top of the armored car waited until the man in the water came up for air, then let loose with a few rounds of machine gun, and the water turned red. The British soldier pointed to 2 German soldiers, motioned them to go into the water and pull out their dead comrade and throw him on top of the truck with the other bodies. The whole thing didn't take more than 5 minutes, and it was an uncanny reminder for me of my first day in Auschwitz. Let me read you a few notes that I had written. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you as a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust, which undoubtedly constituted the greatest crime against humanity ever perpetrated in our recorded history. An estimated 6 million Jews, among them almost 1.5 million children, were killed in gas chambers, in extermination camps, or shot and clubbed or starved to death in an unprecedented slaughter of civilians, which also claimed the lives of an estimated 5 million non-Jewish victims. Civilians, that is, from all walks of life and almost every nationality and religious denomination found in Europe. As a survivor of Auschwitz and other concentration camps, and as one who has lost almost his entire family in the slaughter, I feel very strongly that we must make every effort to keep the memory of these innocent victims alive. But it is not only up to us survivors who are most directly and personally affected. It constitutes an issue which must be faced by all civilized people throughout the world if we are to avoid similar catastrophes in the future. It is a universal duty of all of us to reflect on these terrible events and try to grasp the underlying causes and to understand the lessons which we must learn. Failure to do so may rob us perhaps of the only opportunity to avoid similar catastrophes in the future. Study of the Holocaust has clearly shown that these atrocities and the moral breakdown of an apparently cultured society could never have occurred were it not for the almost unbelievable apathy and spinelessness of the majority of Germans, Poles, Frenchmen, etc., who stood idly by while a relatively small minority committed unspeakable crimes against humanity. This catastrophic moral breakdown was made possible only by the complete abrogation of individual responsibilities, the failure to live up to the most elementary rules of human conduct, and indeed by the moral collapse of most social, political, and religious institutions. Yes, it must be stated that churches too have to assume a measure of responsibility for not speaking out loud and clear, while the most basic principles of human conduct were being trampled underfoot, often by members of their own congregation. Only few, far too few, had the moral courage and strength to stand up to Nazi tyranny and to give shelter and refuge to the persecuted. What, you may ask, is the essence of these sad events, and how can we benefit by learning about them? And most of all, what can I, as an individual do to prevent a recurrence? While I am by no means able to give you answers to all these questions, it can be said that a great deal of soul searching is going on by theologians and religious institutions of all denominations, as well as by universities and schools teaching disciplines dealing with human thought and mind. The study of Holocaust has shown us to what terrible depths seemingly civilized human beings can sink, and force us to take a sharper, more critical look at ourselves. For us Americans, it seems to me, it is a special responsibility to study this subject, since we have long held a position of leadership in areas of human rights and constitutional freedoms, And about the tenets of our Judeo-Christian religions, I believe I do not have to tell you. But I do know that it is up to us, each and every one of us, to learn about these troubled times and to pass this knowledge on to future generations. For our generation has an obligation to make sure that these terrible events in our recent past are not forgotten and that we will never allow these crimes to be erased from history. We must teach our children so that they in turn will teach their children. Teach them to be tolerant of our fellow man. Teach them to have compassion and understanding of those whose views, language, or color of skin differ from ours. We must teach them to take an active interest in the happenings of the world around us. Teach them to speak out loud and clear whenever human rights are being violated, wherever that may be, and to fight abuses of power at any level. We must teach them, most of all, that these crimes were not committed against a small minority, but against all mankind. And finally, let me read to you a few comments to conclude my remarks. When teaching about the Holocaust, we must endeavor to do so only with complete honesty and sincerity. The victims were not all saints, any more than all Germans were criminals. There were cases of inmates abusing their power in ghettos and camps, and in the same token, there are thousands of survivors alive today because some Gentile neighbor, often risking and sometimes losing their own life, helped shelter a Jewish person. Therefore, speaking of the Holocaust should not have an aura of despair and an accusation of guilt, but it should show that an individual has a choice and that there is an element of hope in this world. We must teach our children so that they in turn will teach their children, teach them to be tolerant of our fellow men and women, teach them to have compassion and understanding of those whose views, language, or color of skin differ from ours. We must teach them that words like good and evil, right and wrong, compassion, understanding, morality, and ethics are not just abstract concepts, which are often difficult to understand, but they are concrete measures of our own characters that must be understood, taught, and most importantly, lived by. They form the cornerstones of our civilization that guide and shape our human behavior and ultimately decide our existence as individuals as well as a nation. They are, in the long run, the only safeguards of our way of life and the continuation of the human race. Thank you very much for inviting me here.
Fred some questions. He would entertain answering questions if anyone has questions.
Yes, sir.
Have you participated in the Shoah project?
Pardon?
Have you participated in the Shoah project?
Oh,
Were you interviewed for that?
I have taken part in. I was interviewed in Arizona by the who was that? An organization that seems to have the aim of filming and interviewing all survivors, and I was involved in Arizona in various elements of the Jewish community's efforts to teach in schools in the West Coast. I don't know whether that answers your question, but anything else? Well, if there are no questions, then I hope that you have. Yes?
Did you run across any wonderful people who helped you in any way? There's so many horrible things.
Absolutely. I remember once I was mostly working on street building gangs. You know, we were building roads in Germany. The roads were supposedly necessary to build a complex of industrial factories to be built in to manufacture gasoline and oil from coal deposits in Silesia, and they needed better roads for that. So I worked outdoors throughout my entire stay in concentration camps, and once I was able to see a young boy herding cattle outside in the meadows, and I asked him when I was close to him whether he has anything to eat. And he said, "No, but I have an apple." And he rolled me an apple so that it reached me, and I put it in my pocket. And then he said, "I have something else." And he took a 1 mark note that he had on him and put it under a stone someplace and walked away, and I was able to pick it up. I didn't know what to do with a mark, you know. We had no pockets. We had these strapped uniforms, and only the tops and the pants and the cap and the metal dish for food. That was our entire possession. And I didn't know what to do with a German mark. So when I came home in the evening, I put it in my straw sack. It wasn't really straw. It was made out of wooden shavings instead of straw. And I put it in there, and a couple of days later I had to go in another camp, and there was maybe today, is still in existence today, a single German mark in a straw sack someplace. But later on I found people were more sincere or more able to express their feelings, and I had one SS soldier come to me and whisper to me that he had something under a stone in the back. So I went over there and I found a piece of poppy seed cake. And I found out he was from Czechoslovakia. He was a German and drafted in the last few months of the war, naturally, an older man who was not as indoctrinated into the hateful teachings, and presented me with something that I treasure to this day, poppy seed cake.
I have a comment and then a couple of questions. As I spoke with you earlier, I lived in Germany for 18 and a half years, and I was very struck by the guilt that Germans still feel about what happened in World War II and Holocaust. And I was wondering if, well, I don't even know what I was struck by that so many years later. I've been very moved by your speech today.
Oh, I didn't want to do that, you know.
No, it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing.
Let me just say that I too have difficulty dealing with Germans who have met in the past here and there, quite often in schools, universities, and especially when it comes to people my own age. There are not too many left. I'm 88 years old. But when it comes to younger people, I have no difficulty, because of course we cannot blame the children for their parents' mistakes.
Well, my second question is, as a journalist, I was wondering if you've ever submitted that piece to the Star Tribune, or if it has ever been published, because I would recommend that.
Well, I have not done so, but I've been written up by all kinds of papers. I used to speak quite often about 30, 35 years ago, and I haven't done that much in the last 10, 15 years ago, because I thought, well, everything has to come to an end, you know. But I want to thank you for being such a wonderful audience. I'm sorry I took that.
To take the resolution
See how
home with
easy
them.
it is to take somebody else.
Chris, thanks so much for coming, sharing your story with us. I wish we had more young people here so that they could hear that story. Personally, I think back to when I was a young boy and growing up in a town in North Dakota with my friend Jeff Mandel. And we used to play in the basement of the synagogue, and I didn't understand the Holocaust then. As a young man, and ever since I have. And it's something that everyone needs to remember. So let's all make sure that we keep retelling the story, that we keep this visible, that we do this day of remembrance over again in our community.